First step, I think, is pause and let the whole thing sink in. It'll take time, there'll be emotions, but let the whole thing sink in. Step two is actually see, okay, now given what is whatever it is, given the new situation that you're in, what are the possibilities or opportunities that you have? What are the different things that you can do? And once you know what are the different things that you can do, you figure out how. The next step is to detail out how do you want to go about reaching where you want to reach.
This is the CTQ Smartcast, where we have conversations about upleveling, deliberate practice, and getting future relevant.
Welcome to the Choose to Think Smartcast. We are continuing our conversation with Sirisha. If you haven't heard part one of this episode yet, here's a recap of why we are privileged to have someone like Sirisha share her great wisdom and knowledge with us. So, today we are in the middle of a pandemic still, which took all of us by shock a few months ago. There are ways to handle this better, and we stand to gain from the wisdom of those who in their lives have had enough struggles to deal with adversity and have developed tools to be resilient and to bounce back. And that's Sirisha. Sirisha was just 13 years old when an infection caused her sudden, inexplicable paralysis. In the span of a day, she went from an exuberant and brilliant teenager to someone battling for her life in intensive care. Faced by doctors who gave her a zero chance of recovery, she and her family chose to snub the cards that they had been dealt with and fought back one painful step at a time. Exercising 8 hours a day, refusing a wheelchair, and continuing schooling through all these odds, she went on to top the class 12th boards. Her dream was to become a doctor, and she had fought back from total paralysis to be able to write, to walk, to move. But with just one strong arm, she couldn't do surgery, which was a requisite for her medical degree. And she was denied a chance to pursue medicine. That seemed like a good time to give up. But no, she changed her paths, choosing the unknown world of computers, banking, and management. She went on to IIM Ahmedabad, became a Fulbright scholar, studying at Stanford and Carnegie Mellon. Today, an amazingly gifted mentor to both companies and individuals, along with being a fabulous mom to two wonderful kids, Sirisha helps complexly large organizations scale 10 times over and assists individuals achieve their potential. Her inputs are invaluable to companies who seek her out to get difficult things done. In part one, we went through her story. So if you have the time, we urge you to listen to it as well because it is a fascinating tale of grit and determination that will inspire you all. But today we go a step further and pick her brains to help gather tools we might need to get out of any dark tunnel that life throws us into. So, welcome again, Sirisha. It is very humbling and at the same time really exciting to talk to you about how you brought about this incredible change in your life and something that we hope to learn so that we can do it in our lives as well whenever the need arises. So, we'll go back to your life a bit. And one of the questions that all of us think of when we hear your story is you were only 13 when you got the first shock of your life, which was that the news that you're going to be paralyzed for life, the possibility. Do you remember what it was like? And how does one claw out of a shock like that?
Yeah. So at that time, I think what I remember is, it was one jolt after another hitting us, right? So we didn't expect that verdict to be given by doctors. And at that point, when I was asked, I think if I vaguely remember, it was my dad who asked me, so what do you want to do? I said, I want to go back to school. He said, yes, that's it. So we will make sure you're going back to school. And so that's how I think, if I look back, I think it was my family, my parents and my brother who actually got me started on my physiotherapy and got me to work really hard to make sure I get back on track and I start moving to school. So what I realize when I think back is it's a lot of empathy that they showed, and there was absolutely no sympathy. There was no chance that one could play the victim card at home. And that's how we were always brought up also. So all while growing up, whenever there was any problem in the house, we have a very large extended family. My father has 11 brothers and sisters. My mom has 6 brothers and sisters. So extended family, and anytime there was any problem, right, it was a very objective discussion that used to happen at home, be it financial, be it any other health issues with people at home. It could be any kind of other challenges that we face. It was an objective discussion. Okay, here's the problem. So how do we solve the problem? So even here, because of that grooming all through, I think even here we said, okay, now if I want to go back to school, what is the bare minimum that I need to do? So I should at least learn how to sit. And that's how the whole physiotherapy and scheduling and everything started.
Right. But if you think of it back then, you made some really tough decisions about your health. Even the fact that doctors were telling you that no, there's no out of this. It's probably going to be like this for life. You decided to focus on what you wanted to do and find ways to go about that. You as a family. So how does one make difficult decisions? Do you recommend any steps?
I think it's the dreams that we all as a family dreamt of that basically helped. We said, okay, you still have to get back. Now, some doctors have told, so it's not putting down the doctors or something, but the doctor said that the good news is you're alive, the bad news is you're going to be like this for the rest of your life. So, then we said, okay, why? What has happened to my body was something where my nerves, my nervous system got infected, and that was reversible. A part of it could be reversed with rigorous physiotherapy. We said there's nothing wrong if we try.
Right.
If we wouldn't have tried, then the rest of my life, I would have just been the way I was, right? So
Right.
we said we will not give up trying. Likewise, even later, when I went through a surgery, when a doctor spoke to me about muscle grafting and said, we could try taking a muscle from your leg and putting it in your hand to make it work. That was a very complex surgery. He said there was risk of life, and it was a 12-hour long surgery. I would be put under general anesthesia, so there could be other problems that could arise out of it. But we just said we want to try. I think one thing life taught me is never to give up without trying.
Right.
So basically the dreams in terms of the decision making process, I think it's the dreams that actually drive you, and at every stage looking at what are things that you can control, what are things that you cannot control. Within the controllables, what is the best that you can do?
Right.
Is the typical process I think we followed at every stage. One thing which also played a very big role is the way we were looking at any problem. So for every problem, there's the emotional part and there's the real problem, right? Sometimes problem manifests into something really big because of a lot of emotions playing. At home, always everybody was very balanced when it came to decision making. So there were emotions when we've encountered problems, but then when it came to decision making, it was very balanced, saying, okay, if we keep the emotions aside, what is the real problem that we are actually trying to fight with, and then objectively look at how do you solve that problem.
Right. In fact, you hit the nail probably, because if you think about it, when you're emotionally aroused, it makes it very difficult for you to think rationally. And it's even faced with a problem, often you get caught up in that situation and the emotions of that situation, so that you make it difficult for yourself also to get out of it. So do you recommend the first step that you should, or say first 3 things you should do if you are faced with something and you see yourself getting drawn into the emotions of it rather than the way out of it?
Yeah, first step I think is pause and let the whole thing sink in. It'll take time, there'll be emotions, but let the whole thing sink in. Step 2 is actually see, okay, now given whatever it is, given the new situation that you're in, what are the possibilities or opportunities that you have? What are the different things that you can do? And once you know what are the different things that you can do, you figure out how the next step is to detail out how do you want to go about reaching where you want to reach. For
Hmm.
all of this, I think the ultimate true North Star is having some big lofty dreams, where you're shooting for the stars.
Hmm. And once you decide to do something, what do? Do you shut out all the other possibilities, the other paths that you would have chosen mentally?
They were like, if I talk about my, getting admission into the medical school, but then denied admission after the college actually started, and I started attending it, and that's when I was denied medical admission.
Hmm.
At that point, it would have been irrational if I said that I will try it again the next year.
Hmm.
But at that point, so some opportunities were naturally shut, and then there were all other possibilities, whether I would take up arts and do something around it, whether I would take up other subjects and look at writing civil services, whether I go for computer applications. At
Hmm.
that point, the rational decision making part was, what is it that I would probably be interested in, and where is it that I can some skills that I have, I can use them,
Hmm.
and I have the genuine interest and motivation from within to actually pursue that field.
Right. In fact, there's a follow up to this a question which Ankita, one of our colleagues, has for you. That how important is it to hold on to dreams, and when do you know it's time to let them go or replace them?
As long as things are in your control, I think I've always believed in holding on to my dreams,
Okay.
but also constantly reflect, be rational in thinking to actually see when is it that things are beyond your control. And that's when you let go of that. But again, you create another dream for yourself, which again is a bigger, loftier version where a lot of things are in your control.
Right. And Omkar has a question which is sort of linear to this, which is at various points when you decided to rewire, it seemed as if you had a choice between new realities. There were two different paths, but both were new to you. They were new normals. What helped you pick the ones that you did over the others?
um at every stage, if I look at it, right, when I had to move from medicine to computer science, and when I made a conscious call of moving from computer science to going ahead and doing an MBA, or in fact even in my career when I was a well paid banker and I decided to move into technology, when I was doing very well on the business side of it and I decided to move into working around people and culture. All of these stages, I think it was a very, very conscious choice of the option that I was picking, and then there was no looking back.
Hmm.
So I spent a lot of time. My decisions were not instant. I spent a lot of time making all of these decisions. I had a phenomenal role played by a lot of mentors and coaches I had along the way who would
Hmm.
give me multiple perspectives, let me look at things from different points of view. So I consciously made an effort to talk to a lot of people before I made every decision. But at the end of it, it was my decision. And once I
Hmm.
made the decision, I wasn't looking back at it, at things.
Great. You mentioned that you became a great listener after this experience, that when you were listening to your lectures, whether they were in school, because you weren't able to take your own notes, you were really good at academics and you wanted to be in school, so that the motivation was really high. But you mentioned in one of our conversations that you became a great listener after this. Can you take us through this change? What do you mean, and what makes you a good listener, and how to be one?
Yeah. So what happened was, after 6 months, when I could sit with some amount of support, I said I wanted to go back to school, because
Hmm.
that was the goal with which we were working, right, at home. Saying, if I want to go back to school, the minimum that I should be able to do is to sit in the class.
Hmm.
So I managed to learn to sit with some support. I could barely walk, in the sense that if somebody was holding me, properly giving me support, I could walk a few steps.
Hmm.
And that's when I said I want to go back to school, because for me, getting back to school, getting back to friends, getting back to that academic setting seemed very, very important at that point
Hmm.
in time.
Hmm.
I couldn't write. So whenever any of my friends, I think my classmates, teachers helped me a lot. So whoever finished writing first used to write down the notes. But then in class, I couldn't make notes, and that was standard 9. And
Hmm.
I was supposed to be taking a lot of notes when the teacher is also teaching in the class, right?
Hmm.
That wasn't possible. Now, the only other part was, okay, how do I make it happen? I would sit in class with complete focus, basically silencing out everything around me and just listen to the teacher teaching. And
Okay.
that improved my overall listening ability. So it was that, after doing that, if I come back home and once, after listening intently to the teacher teaching in the class, if I come back home and read it once, that would have been sufficient. Another reason that consciously led me to build this active listening ability was the deal with my dad was, you can go to school, but you need to work out, come back home and work out for 4 hours, because we have
Okay.
a long way to go. Now,
Mm.
if you don't work out for 4 hours, you don't go to school the next day. So that was tough, because then I had to. My school was ending at 3:30. I would come back home at 4 o'clock, and I by then 4:30 we would go for exercising. Come back by 8:30, and I would be dead tired. I didn't have
Mm.
time to study. So that's when I realized what happens in school is the only thing that I can do when it comes to actually studying for my exams also. And
Right.
that was the primary motivator for me at that point to go back to school. That, I was doing very well in school, I was completely enjoying myself in school, so I said I want to go back and do the same thing. So
Right.
that's how it got me to active listening, and mentally recalling a lot of things, because the only way I could write the exams was with the help of a writer. I couldn't write my
Mm.
exams. So
Right.
they always used to be a writer, and I would need to dictate the answers to them. So that's how I think circumstances forced me to become a very, very active listener.
Yeah, interesting that you mentioned this actually, because I was just going to come to that point as well. That when you had to undergo this extreme physical change, especially for those who haven't heard the previous episode of this, you had to switch from your left hand to right hand. You were naturally a left-hander, but because you weren't able to move that hand, you had to switch to right-handedness. Then you had to narrate answers instead of writing them yourself. How does change feel, and how long does it take before you get used to it? Is there a period which is most difficult, and when you have to power through, even if it is really tough to do it?
So the two uh, changes or instances that you mentioned, were the ones where I didn't have any other option.
Okay.
Right, so my left hand was paralyzed, and because it was the first affected, I couldn't move anything in my hand.
Mm.
So which meant I couldn't write with my left hand. And later, when I started working after a lot of workout, after probably about a year or year and a half, was when my I could start holding up, with my right.
Mm.
I could actually start writing decently well with my right hand. My left hand was not moving still; the fingers were
Mm.
not moving. So I didn't have an option but to start learning how to uh, do things with my right, because that
Mm.
was the only that was the only hand that was functional, where my fingers would move and I could hold a pen in them.
Mm.
And from writing my own exams to actually narrating answers and getting someone else to write an exam, again,
Mm.
was not a choice. If I had to be in the academic system, that's how it would work. So there were other places where I had a choice of going through that change, or just saying that my older self is much better and let me just stick to that. So
Mm.
all of these times, I think what I figured out is change is very frustrating at times. Like, for instance, I would be dictating something to the writer, and the writer obviously is not one of your teachers of that subject or something who understand it, right?
Mm.
Or drawing diagrams in biology used to be
Mm.
the most frustrating part, or doing some
Right.
geometry constructions,
Right.
because here I would be trying to tell them how I want this, but I'm not able to express it. And or the way I'm expressing, the person who's actually doing it wasn't able to follow. So
Mm.
all of this became very, very frustrating. But then
Mm.
after a point in time, when you know that this is how it is, then you start adapting to it. Then I started figuring out how I want things to be done. So at home, I used to actually, I remember we had to draw the structure of a plant cell in
Mm.
my ninth standard. I think my first term exam.
Mm.
So I actually, and I wanted her to draw the mitochondria at a place, nucleus at one place, all of that.
Mm. Mm.
I wanted it all to be very, very precise. So I used to actually figure names for those shapes and tell her,
Okay.
draw this shape, and
Mm.
tell her to draw the nucleus 6 centimeters from the top.
Okay.
So that's how I figured that out. Yeah, I think while you're going through that change, it gets very frustrating. But once you know that it's working for you and you're able to write the exams well, it's
Mm.
also equally rewarding. You
Right.
feel happy about that process, and then it becomes your new normal. I think
Right.
the most often used word now, right? The new normal.
Yeah.
So
So I was wondering, frustration is something all of us face at different tasks, irrespective of even our ages. I think even children nowadays, you hear that, this is so unfair. Why do I have to do this? Why can't I do this? Or whether it's us at work, where we feel, even if it's our internal conversation to ourselves, which is, it's easy to get stuck in that frustrated point. But you mentioned that there's a point where beyond frustration there's adaptation, where you have to move, you have to get your new skills and move on. Is there a thought process or even a environment which you can have to help you ease quickly from this frustration phase to the adaptation and getting on with it phase?
I think the process of I'll first talk about the process and then the environment. So the process of adapting to change is where you're actually spelling out your frustration. Okay, so that leads to adaptation, because what happens is when you're actually spelling out your frustration, you first realize that you're only tackling the symptoms, right? When you're frustrated about the. For me, it used to be, frustrated with the writer. Okay, because the writer just doesn't understand is what I used to come back home and tell my mom. And there used to be these conversations at home with parents where I used to say, this getting very frustrating because today I think I would have lost marks in my paper because the writer wasn't able to follow this, or I was dictating and the person who was writing was not writing at the pace at which I wanted, and so I couldn't finish everything within the stipulated time. All of that. So then my parents used to say, okay, so what actually happened? So digging deeper, right? Doing all keep asking questions all the whys, right? Like Simon Sinek says, keep asking why till you actually figure out what is the real problem. So they used to keep asking, okay, so what happened? So what can you do to make sure it doesn't happen again? So they used to give me a very patient ear, listen to all my venting out first, and then we used to come to, okay, what is the real problem and how can I solve that problem in the next paper? That used to be the new armory with which I used to go to the exam the next time. And then we figured that is working, something is not working, so we used to come back and change it. I think being open and flexible, actually having either conversations with someone where you come down to what is your root cause, or conversations with your own self, if that's the best way. If you can manage have conversations with your own self, trying to understand what is the real thing that is actually frustrating, and then get around to solving the problem. Now this is frustration about not things that are in my control to a certain extent, right? But there's also frustration about, okay, you're not able to do things yourself and you need a lot of help and all of that, which at that point things were beyond my control, and all I knew was, I'm exercising, I'm working out. I used to probably have those occasional outbursts saying it's getting very tiring and I'm not able to keep up with the energy levels, and I want to just sit at home and study, kind of things. But at the end of the day, I think your ecosystem who keeps showing you what is your final destination, your ecosystem who makes you uncomfortable with your current state and always makes you work towards becoming better, a better version of yourself, whatever is that better is in the context, was something that started making me pick up all the broken pieces and start working hard again. I think over a period that got into me. So now if I get into a comfort zone, I constantly keep nudging myself, saying, you know what, you have to do something different. You're doing this and you're very comfortable doing this, so try aiming for something higher.
Right. That's some great tips there for all of us to handle those sort of situations. So we'll go on to what you called co-conspirators in your journey, in your transformation. So you mentioned the support that you got first of your family, then also of your peers and teachers, every step of the way when you were young, especially, and through your life as well. What they did, you mentioned, was they showed you empathy but never pity. So I have two questions for you from both sides of the coin. One is, suppose you are a mentor to someone. how does one show empathy but not pity? And two, as a person yourself, how does one stop going down that sinkhole of self pity?
Sure. Um, so co-conspirators are people who you take along, who you tell them that this is what I want to achieve, and I want you to join in my journey to reach that destination. Right. So you effectively become partners in crime. So I've consciously been recruiting co-conspirators everywhere at home. For instance, because of this lockdown, when there are lots of chores to be done in the house, right? The kids also have become co-conspirators in making sure we are still able to manage everything and retain our energy levels to do all the work that all of us have to do. So get people along, talk to them about what you want to do and how you want to do it, and get them on literally on board with you on that journey. So I've been very conscious reaching out to people and making sure if there is something that someone can help me on, I can learn something from someone, or I need suggestions from people, or I need people to act as those periodic sounding boards when you're on a big journey, and have always been keeping them involved, keeping them updated about how I've uh, what is the progress I'm making and how I want to move forward. So that's about the co-conspirators part. Now, if as a mentor, so today I play the role of a mentor to a lot of people. I'm also a formal coach, and I coach people in their life journeys as well. What I make sure I don't do to ensure that it's empathy and it doesn't boil down to sympathy is I listen. I listen to everything that they have to say, whatever challenges they are going through. I'm no one to judge whether it is right, wrong. Somebody in their life is right, wrong. Things have been fair, unfair. I'm no one to judge. I always boil it down to asking questions to see, okay, so now what? What do we want to do, and where do we want to go? So in this process, I'm only making sure that I don't pass any of my judgments. I don't become. It is what it is, right? So I ensure I don't pass any judgments there, but instead ask them how can I help them to get to where they want to get to. So that's what I do as a mentor. Personally, again, I've been writing a book about my life story, and I call that book The Sign of Life. It's like my life has been like a sine curve, right? Uh, with all its crests and troughs all over. So all ups and downs, I think what parents have taught me early on is to dream really big. And that's where, like I was mentioning in part one, right? Where I was in my fourth standard, I used to sign off as Sirisha and FRCS. I used to write it as Dr. Sirisha and FRCS. So right from very beginning, I think they've taught me, I've learned from them to dream really big. And when I was dreaming big, that's when all of these smaller things seem like hurdles. So that's how I think I've always been picking up, trying to not to get into self-pity. There are times when that happens, but at least it makes me more aware that I'm getting into a self-pity zone, and I better pull up my socks and start working towards what I want to work. So fundamental belief, or the mantra that I believe in, is be the best that you can be every single day.
Right. That's a really interesting answer. So there is a follow-up to that, which, since you mentioned mentors earlier as well, what I'm curious about is you have picked up mentors throughout your life, and how does one go about it? Often you meet people you would love to have as mentors, but how does one establish that relationship?
Reaching out to people with authenticity. Okay, being your true self, talking about your vulnerabilities, and reaching out, being very specific on what is the area that you want them to help you out on, is something that has always worked, that's always helped, and got a lot of amazing people who have contributed to my life journey. And even now, as we speak, there are a lot of mentors who help me in different areas. I think what they appreciate, when I say authenticity, what they appreciate is you being very open, and talking in a very concrete sense, and also showing your vulnerabilities and you don't need to put up that. It's not the LinkedIn kind of profile that you put out to people, but you actually talk about who you are, the real person that you are, what you're doing, and in doing what you're doing, what are you really doing for yourself. So talking to people, connecting with people, whenever I find someone interesting, I make it a point that I stay in touch with them. I make it a point that I share things with them, and also be very specific on what is it that I want them to help me on, or where is it that I want their suggestions acting as a sounding board, or share some of their experiences. And it's worked beautifully. I think people are very open when you go with this. I've never ever gone to people saying, get me this job or get me this role, or can you tell me what I should do. I've always made sure I did my homework before I reached out to people, but I think people are very, very open. That's one area that we don't leverage too much today, is the collective experience of all people around us and people in our networks. There's so much that we can learn. We don't need to make all the same mistakes. At least some of them we don't need to make again.
Absolutely right. And getting that communication skill in place, getting to know how to be okay approaching people, how to stay in touch, is also a life skill that is really useful.
Yeah. And it's not just transactional. It's not just exchanging business cards and making sure you are bombarding them with messages, but it's genuinely reach out to people who you want to. So number of connections in your network really doesn't matter, but the depth of connections is what makes a difference.
So on this note, we are going to take a short break. We'll be back with you talking about how you did the mental game, as we put it, how you handled the mental side of things, and how to stay prepared, which is what can you do going ahead. So welcome back to the CTQ Smartcast. We are speaking to Sirisha on how she rewired, and we are going on to talk to her about how the mental game is handled. So Sirisha, a question for you from Omkar is, how do you take care of your mental health?
Very interesting. Because mental health is something that's gaining a lot of importance now, right? But back then, and I'm talking about 94, I didn't realize that it was very important to take care of it, but that's essentially what my family was doing to me. Parents and my brother, my immediate family, close friends, they were ensuring that at no point in time I would feel dejected. There was nothing special uh, treatment or something, in the sense that people are not treating me differently. So I was part of everyone, along with everyone. So that made me a lot more comfortable. There was always somebody or the other to talk to. And I also had a lot of open conversations with my parents, which probably never got me to stress out about anything. And very, very pragmatic conversations where it was all about, okay, how do we solve the problem. So that, I think, taking care of mental health is extremely important, because today when I coach some people and I'm talking to people in corporates, I see that people take a lot of pressure to their heart. It's a lot of undue pressure built. There's no real reason why they should have so much stress around. So taking care of that is extremely, extremely important. So even today, because I think I got used to that, I talk to friends. I constantly talk to people to understand what are my challenges, and I also do a lot of reflection. So I understand myself well, so I know when is it that I need help, when is it that I should go and talk to someone, when is it that I can think and solve the problem on my own. Yeah, so being very conscious about how you handle your mental state, when is it that you'll have conversations with others, so that you can separate the emotions from the real problem and objectively look at the real problem, very, very important according to me.
Great. And you mentioned continuous reflection. Does documenting one's life story or keeping a journal every day, does it help?
Writing every day, journaling every day is something I've been doing for a while now, and helps me a lot, because it brings closure to my day. Two, it makes me realize that yes, I've done something today. Remember, I was talking about my primary motto in life is to be the best that I can be every single day. So it makes me realize that yes, today I have done something, and in case it's not been a very fruitful day, it also helps me realize what I should do differently the next day. And it's more like an account of yourself, right? You also write about your emotions, you write about things you should have done differently. So all of that, when I look back at some of the old writings, in fact I was looking at something that I was the journal that I was maintaining when I was studying at Ahmedabad, and
Mm.
it's very very fascinating, interesting to actually see the emotions one was going through, and the small wins which over a period of time we tend to forget, and we don't celebrate those wins anymore.
You actually have journals from a long time ago as well.
Yeah, from my Ahmedabad days, simply because that was when I started writing using the computer. So the
Mm.
physical journals, I think my parents still have a couple of them that I
Okay.
used to write. But uh, after that, I think a lot of stuff is what I've been documenting. And for me, while when I'm trying to work on my book now, I'm reading through a lot of those, and that's how I'm able to actually relive some of those emotions that I was going through, some of those thoughts which now seem very childish, or which now seem
Mm.
very trivial, were real problems on few days. So it's very interesting reading through that. And writing has also become very therapeutic, because you're remembering the challenges, triumphs, and you're also giving yourself an opportunity to analyze yourself in the past, right?
Right.
It also gives you that amount of comfort. You're comforting yourself, saying that these are all things that you did at some point in time. It gives you an account of all the uh, wins, the losses, even if they're very very trivial small ones, and more importantly, all the emotions associated with them.
Mhm. So it's if you don't mind sharing, what is the format in which you write your own journal? Is it a letter to yourself? Is it a structured way in which the positives, negatives, one thing I learned? How is your structure like?
It's mostly free flowing. I
Mhm.
try to talk about what I went through, what I could have done differently, and this has evolved over time, I should
Okay.
say. My initial ones were just about how my day was, interesting people I spoke to, and what happened, and what I didn't like about. And when I'm reading my I'm a journal, I realized that that was the first time I was living in a hostel,
Hmm.
away from home. So a lot of other things that were going on, and how things were, how people were responding, how I was reacting, what I told people, all of that. So it's just about an account of how my day was, uh, to make sure it continues as a habit, or even on real bad days when I don't have energy, I at least try writing a couple of lines. On
Hmm.
good days, when I'm in that zone of writing, it ends up becoming couple of pages.
Right.
So there's no structure, but yeah, I try to capture all of these in terms of how my day was,
Mhm.
the highs and the lows.
And do you read every day as well? Is there a particular sort of a diet, informational diet that you follow when it comes to, staying on course with what you want to do in your life?
Yeah, everyday reading is again a habit that I've inculcated, and as part of my reading diet, like you were calling it, right? I make sure I bookmark a lot of stuff. I make sure I'm spending a couple of hours reading. Reading again is something that gets me into a very relaxed zone. It's also a rabbit hole where what I buffer to read for half an hour, I end up clicking on some links. One thing leads to another, and I realize I've spent my entire day just reading. But
Hmm.
I do that, and I'm also part of the CDQ reading compound. So it's 963 days that we have been reading every day,
Right.
collectively. So that's also something that's going on. Reading again has been a very very integral part of me for a very very long period of time now, maybe over 15-16 years.
Right. So we move on to the last part of our conversation here, where we just cross over into the idea of if we can do something today to prepare ourselves for situations like these, or at least to be ready to handle any situation that comes our way in a better manner. So, do you think there are any skills that we can build today that will help us face situations better?
Yeah, a skill that gets built over a period of time and it just gets better every day is reflecting and having a heightened level of self-awareness. Because I realize the more I know about myself, the more I'll start loving myself, and the more confident and balanced I will be in the decisions that I'm taking, the way I'm reacting, responding to situations. Another thing, like I was mentioning earlier, is the whole aspect of being open, looking at things with an open mind, uh, being flexible, adaptable, accepting your failure or setback at face value, and trying to figure out how you can uh, get back. So get up every time you fall down, kind of a thing. And always shake yourself from constantly out of your comfort zone. That will involve a lot of learning, unlearning, relearning. Yeah, I've seen this in the physical aspect of life also, where for me it has been trying to learn how to stand up, walk. Or I used to walk in a initially when I started walking, because I couldn't manage the body weight. It was like moving here and there when I'm walking, and not able to walk in a straight line. And then you'll have to unlearn that, learn it. Same thing applies with all skills that we learn also, that be open constantly, shake yourself out of that comfort zone, because that, one, broadens your horizon, two, increases your depth, three, makes you very, very active mentally to constantly keep learning.
Right. And you mentioned how exercise is also a big part of your life because of your rehabilitation as well. But even otherwise, do you sense that when you're exercising and when you're making sure you address your physical health as well, that your sharper, your mental health improves as well?
Like they say, sound mind in a sound body. I think that's extremely true. The amount of physical activity, while all of us know the science of it, right? It releases all the chemicals that makes us feel good and happy. I think physically being alert and active actually triggers a lot of balance in me. And continuously exercising, make sure for me it's like a good thing done for my body, right? And over a period of time, I think I learned to treasure my body and give it due respect. And it also makes I have realized that it also makes me really active to pick things up faster and get things done faster on days that I start with exercising significantly and then sitting and working. Yeah,
Right.
that's very important according to me.
Right. And a question related to reflection, which you mentioned earlier, is you also said that you shouldn't be judgmental. So, how do you reflect on your own behavior or on your own day, what you have done without being judgmental? What sort of outlook should you have while doing these self reflection exercises?
It's like how they tell in meditation, right? When you're meditating, you don't have to control your thoughts. You just let the thoughts pass and you look at them as an observer. For me, in my reflection, the reflection exercises that I do very, very often, I do that. Just it's looking at my life from standing as a third person and seeing what all is going on and all the emotions that come with each thing. The things that I don't like, I get angry at someone, I feel sorry for myself, all of that, just as a third person standing and looking at what I'm doing. And then look at, okay, do I want to change any of this? Are any of these things making me unhappy, and what do I want to change about it? Over a period of time, that'll also help you realize how you will respond or react to certain situations. And if those are things that you want to control, that's the best data input that you can get, right? When conversation goes to this level, that is when I'll start snapping people. So then if I don't want that to happen because it's making me feel bad, then I will make sure I don't take the conversation to that level. Or if the conversation is going to that level, the moment it reaches just probably a couple of minutes before that itself, there'll be all these red alarms ringing in my head saying, just stop, or you're going down that same path again. So I think over a period of time, you'll start understanding how you respond and react to different things. And that's how reflection helps. It also helps you understand what's your passion, what's the area that you want to work on, because you figure out that constantly there's certain things that you do which invariably evoke a positive response or a feeling of happiness or a sense of satisfaction in you. And so
Right.
you figure out what is it that you want to do about it.
Right. And in your work experience, when you're helping people of different companies grow and to realize their potential, is there a problem or is there a question that you face over and over again from different people, which is commonly seen? Something that a pattern, a way in which you find yourself constantly telling the same thing to multiple people, an area that probably affects us all.
A lot of times people say, this is what is the current situation, this is where we want it to be. So change is not magical. Change is not going to happen overnight. You're talking about people and behaviors, right? So it takes a period of time to change. So that's something that constantly comes up where, everybody wants like a magical shift. Can we get it done in 3 months and 5 months? And the other part is the whole role that uh, people play. So, for instance, if it's individuals, the role the ecosystem around them plays. If it's an organization and an employee in an organization, it's the role the culture of the organization plays in which plays a significant role in how the person responds. Or how a person reacts to a certain situation, right? Making people understand that all of these are uh, interlinked, and it is not A is bad, B is good, but it's A behaves in a certain way because of XYZ reasons, and B behaves in a certain way because of ABC reasons. So all of that is nothing is standalone. How a person responds, they're not bots. How a person responds, reacts, performs, how a team performs, how an organization performs is a sum total of a different of multiple things. And looking at things at that deeper level is very, very important.
Right.
And the third thing that constantly comes up is a lot of times people talk about symptoms. We tend to react to symptoms a lot more than actually taking that effort or facing that ambiguity to dig deeper into finding the real problem. And that's what I help people do.
Right. A last question. So, do you look at people who complain about lesser things and wonder how to tell them how to change their view of thinking?
So, not changing anybody's view or thinking, but for me, when I was 13, whatever I went through, at that point, whether I was breathing or not was the issue. Everything else was not. So, for me, when I look at any other challenge in life, it seems like a small line in front of a bigger line, right? So, if I rate that as 100, whether I'm breathing or not, as a challenge at 100, everything else for me, when I benchmark my problems and challenges, always falls less than 40. uh, so uh, so that's for me about how I look at other setbacks that I've constantly encountered at some point in life or the other. When I look at telling people, I know I'm very conscious that I don't trivialize their problem. For everyone, their problem is the big problem. I consciously make sure that I don't trivialize it. At the same time, I keep drawing references to bigger problems that the same individual has faced and try marking that as 100 and see everything else is less than that. I think
Right.
fundamentally what helps is, like I was saying, mentioning earlier also, is separating the emotions from the problem.
Right.
That helps things seem much smaller than what they actually seem to be initially.
Right. So we end this talk with a few rapid fire questions, not in a very current year style at all, a very CTQ style. So I'm just going to fire them off. You give me your answers as you think best. So are you
Okay.
ready?
Sure.
All right. The first thing you think of when you're faced with bad news.
Let's face it.
One really underestimated habit.
Reflection.
If you could write one motto on the walls of your children's room, what would it be?
Be the best that you can be every single day.
The one skill or ability that helped you navigate this life.
My dreams. Dreaming. Power of dreaming, if it's a skill.
Okay. And if you could have one superpower, what would it be?
Have super high energy levels all through the day so I can get a lot more done in my day.
All right. What's one thing you would change about yourself?
My discipline to sticking to my sleep routine. Sometimes work gets very exciting and I end up working long hours.
Okay. And a lasting advice to get out of any situation that you face yourself in.
work hard, figure out how to get out of that situation if it's a bad one, or how to navigate it to figure light at the end of the dark tunnel.
All right. Thanks a lot, Seisha. It has been an incredible journey. And thanks a lot for giving us ideas and tips which we can probably think of to better ourselves. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Anasi. I had fun talking.